The first rays of dawn stretched across the Serengeti, painting the vast grasslands in hues of amber and gold. Acacia trees stood like sentinels against the horizon, their twisted branches casting long, skeletal shadows over the gently swaying grass. A warm breeze carried the scent of damp earth and distant rain, whispering secrets only the land could understand. Daniel Whitaker sat behind the wheel of his battered Land Rover, his fingers drumming absent-mindedly against the dashboard. Even after all these years, the Serengeti still held him in its grasp, filling him with the same quiet reverence he had felt the first time he set foot on its soil. This land was old, older than any history book could capture. It had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the migration of creatures great and small, and the endless cycle of life and death that played out upon its golden stage. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the rifle strapped across his chest. Not for hunting, never for that. His job was to protect, to preserve what little remained of nature's purest wonders. The war against poachers was relentless, and each day brought new battles. Some were won. Others left scars. Daniel had his fair share of those. His face, weathered by the African sun, bore the faint lines of a man who had seen too much and carried the weight of it in silence. A small scar cut through his left eyebrow, a reminder of a skirmish with ivory hunters years ago. His eyes, once bright with youthful idealism, had dulled into something more pragmatic. He had long since accepted that he could not save everything. But that never stopped him from trying. As he reached for his canteen, a voice crackled through the radio clipped to his belt. "Danny, you there?" He smirked at the familiar Kenyan accent. Joseph Kamau, his closest friend and fellow ranger, always refused to use formal radio protocol. "Yeah, I'm here," Daniel replied, bringing the radio to his lips. "Heard you took the southern route this morning. What's the verdict?" Daniel scanned the landscape, his trained eyes searching for anything out of place. Quiet so far. A few wildebeest near the river, a lone elephant by the baobab trees. No sign of anything unusual. There was a pause on the other end, then a soft chuckle. "You always say that, but trouble follows you like a shadow." Daniel grinned to spite himself. "Just keeping the peace, Kamau." The radio fizzed with static before Kamau's voice returned, a little more serious now. "Be careful out there. Got reports of traps found near the western ridge yesterday. If those bastards are back, I don't want you walking into something nasty." Daniel nodded, though he knew Kamau couldn't see him. Understood. He had encountered traps before, crude snares meant to ensnare antelope or zebra, their metal wires tightening around helpless limbs until there was nothing left but pain and slow death. He hated them. But poachers were merciless, and where there was prey, there were always hunters lurking in the shadows. He put the Land Rover into gear and rolled forward, the tires kicking up a thin veil of dust behind him. He would make his rounds, check the usual paths, and, if luck was on his side, return to camp with nothing more than another quiet morning under his belt. But luck was a fickle thing in the Serengeti. And as Daniel drove toward the rising sun, he had no idea that by day's end, he would come face to face with a creature that would change his life forever. The first sign of trouble came in the form of blood. A thin trail of crimson drops spattered across the sun-bleached grass, stark against the golden landscape. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as he brought the Land Rover to a slow halt, dust swirling around the tires. He stepped out, boots crunching against dry earth, and crouched low to inspect the scene. The blood was fresh, too fresh. Whatever had been wounded was nearby, and from the size of the droplets, it wasn't small. A silent warning settled into his bones. Daniel reached for his rifle, not to use, but to have at the ready. Experience had taught him that the wilderness held no mercy for the careless. Poachers weren't the only threat out here. A wounded predator was a dangerous one. He followed the blood, his movements slow and measured. the Serengeti was eerily still, save for the whisper of wind through the grass. Even the usual calls of birds and distant animal chatter had faded. A hush had fallen over the land, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then he saw it. A massive lion lay sprawled beneath the shade of a thorny acacia tree, its dark mane tangled with twigs and matted with blood. The beast's flank rose and fell in labored breaths, its golden eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. But what truly made Daniel's stomach twist was the cruel wire wrapped tight around the lion's front leg, cutting deep into muscle and flesh. A poacher's snare. His grip on the rifle tightened. A snared lion was unpredictable, one moment weak and docile, the next a fury of claws and teeth. And yet, as Daniel stood there, staring into those amber eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected. Pain. Not just the physical kind. A deeper, more desperate kind of suffering. The lion did not snarl, did not bare its fangs in warning. It simply looked at him. And Daniel understood. He had seen the same look in soldiers' eyes during his time in the military. The look of someone who had fought and lost. Who had struggled against fate only to realize the battle was already over. It was the look of surrender. Slowly, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and crouched, keeping his movements deliberate. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you." The lion's ear flicked, but it did not move. Daniel reached for the pack slung over his back and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. His heart pounded in his chest as he assessed the snare. The wire had cut deep, almost to the bone. If the lion hadn't been found soon, infection would have set in. A slow, agonizing death. He inched closer, feeling the weight of every breath between them. If the lion lashed out now, he wouldn't stand a chance. But it didn't. Whether by instinct or some deeper understanding, the beast stayed still. With steady hands, Daniel gripped the wire and began to cut. The first snap of metal made the lion flinch, a deep growl rumbling in its throat. Daniel froze, muscles coiled like springs. A few tense seconds passed before the lion settled again. Daniel worked quickly, sweat dripping down his brow despite the morning chill. Each twist of the wire sent a fresh trickle of blood down the lion's leg. By the time the last piece of the snare was removed, Daniel's hands were slick with sweat, his breath coming in short, shallow gulps. But he wasn't finished. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a small bottle of antiseptic and a roll of gauze. This was the dangerous part. The lion had tolerated his presence thus far, but pain was a powerful trigger. "I know, buddy," Daniel murmured as he poured the antiseptic over the wound. "This is gonna hurt." The lion's entire body tensed. A guttural sound, half growl, half groan, rumbled through its chest. Its claws flexed, digging into the dirt. Daniel kept his movements quick and efficient. He wrapped the gauze around the lion's leg, his fingers working with practiced precision. The whole process took less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. When he finally pulled back, he exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. The lion blinked at him, its breathing still ragged but steady. It did not move, did not try to flee. It simply stared. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Didn't think I'd be playing doctor for a lion today." Still, he knew better than to linger. He stepped back, giving the lion space. It hesitated, as if testing the weight of its injured leg. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it rose. Daniel watched in awe as the lion, majestic even in its weakened state, stood tall. Its gaze met his one last time. And then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the golden sea of grass. Only when it was gone did Daniel allow himself to truly breathe. Daniel returned to the ranger station just as the sun dipped below the Serengeti's endless horizon, washing the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Dust clung to his boots as he trudged toward the outpost, his body exhausted but his mind racing with the weight of the encounter. The lion, Bantu, as he had silently begun to call it, should have killed him. Or at the very least, it should have fled in fear the moment it was freed. But instead, it had stood, watched, and walked away with an air of understanding that unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. He barely had time to set his rifle down before Joseph Kamau, his longtime partner, slapped a calloused hand against his shoulder. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Joseph said, grinning. "Or maybe a lion." Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Something like that." The other rangers gathered around as he told the story. As expected, it was met with skepticism. "A lion let you get close enough to cut a snare?" One ranger scoffed, leaning back against the wooden table. "And it didn't rip you apart?" Daniel shrugged. "It didn't even try." Laughter rumbled through the room. Someone muttered about how long the heat had been getting to him. Another ranger, a younger man fresh out of training, simply shook his head in disbelief. "Lions don't think that way," he said. "They're animals. Instinct. Fight or flight." Even Joseph, the one man Daniel had expected to believe him, raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me a full-grown male let you play nurse, and then just walked away?" Daniel met his friend's gaze. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Joseph studied him for a long moment, then chuckled. "Either you just met the most unusual lion in Africa, or you're losing your damn mind." Daniel had no argument to offer. Maybe it was both. The days passed, and with them, the disbelief of his colleagues faded into the background of routine patrols and paperwork. Daniel, however, could not shake the feeling that something had changed. It started subtly, a sensation prickling at the back of his neck when he ventured too far from the outpost alone. The distinct, primal awareness of being watched. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia. Then he saw it. One morning, while checking for snares near the riverbanks, he glanced toward a rocky ridge in the distance. A lone figure stood silhouetted against the rising sun, its black mane shifting in the wind. Daniel froze, gripping the strap of his rifle. Bantu. The lion stood perfectly still, watching. Not hunting. Not stalking. Just watching. The moment stretched thin between them before the lion turned and vanished into the tall grass. It happened again 3 days later, this time, near the watering hole on the southern plains. And again the next week, along the acacia groves. Each time, the pattern was the same. The lion would appear at a distance, hold its ground for a few moments, and then disappear as though it had never been there at all. Joseph noticed Daniel's distracted expression over dinner one evening. "You've been different," he mused, breaking off a piece of dried bread. "Like a man with a shadow he can't shake." Daniel hesitated before answering. "I keep seeing that lion." Joseph raised an eyebrow. "The one you freed?" Daniel nodded. Joseph chuckled, shaking his head. "So you're telling me a lion is following you around like a lost puppy?" Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know what I'm telling you." Joseph smirked. "Maybe it's a ghost lion." Daniel said nothing. Because deep down, he wasn't sure it wasn't. The proof came one evening, just as the last light drained from the sky. Daniel had been investigating a watering hole after hearing reports of unusual activity. Poachers often poison water sources to weaken their prey before moving in for the kill, and the thought of finding dead animals floating in the shallows left a bitter taste in his mouth. He was alone, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he crouched near the water's edge. The air was thick with humidity, the usual evening sounds of insects and distant animal calls filling the silence. Then the hyenas came. Daniel heard them before he saw them, the rustle of grass, the quiet, guttural laughter rippling through the dusk. He turned slowly, heart pounding as 5 pairs of glowing eyes emerged from the gloom. Hyenas were scavengers, but they were also opportunists. A lone human, crouched and unaware, could just as easily be a meal as a wounded gazelle. Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle. One of the hyenas crept forward, its yellow teeth flashing as it let out a high-pitched chitter. Another circled to his right, blocking any easy escape. A slow, cold realization settled over him. He had made a mistake. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a sound that sent shivers down his spine. A roar. Deep. Earth-shaking. The hyenas froze. Their heads snapped toward the unseen threat, ears flattening against their skulls. Then, out of the tall grass, Bantu emerged. His dark mane bristled as he moved forward, his powerful shoulders rolling with every step. He did not run. He did not pounce. He simply walked, slow and deliberate, like a king reclaiming his throne. The hyenas knew. With startled yelps, they scattered, their laughter twisting into fearful whines as they disappeared into the night. For a long moment, Daniel and the lion stared at each other. Bantu's chest heaved, his amber eyes reflecting the fading light. He did not linger. He simply turned and melted back into the Serengeti, swallowed by the darkness as though he had never been there at all. Daniel exhaled shakily, gripping the rifle with hands that had suddenly begun to tremble. "Impossible," he whispered. But in his heart, he already knew the truth. Bantu was watching over him. The Serengeti had entered its cruelest season. The dry months came with an unforgiving grip, draining waterholes to cracked earth and turning grasslands into brittle, sun-scorched wastelands. Every creature, predator and prey alike, was locked in a desperate struggle against thirst. Rivers that once ran thick with life now held only shallow, muddy pools, drawing animals together in uneasy truces, bound by necessity rather than peace. But thirst made even the gentlest creatures dangerous. Elephants, usually the calm giants of the plains, grew restless. The scarcity of water made them unpredictable, their tempers short. Herds wandered farther than usual in search of sustenance, their matriarchs leading them with the urgency of survival. When an elephant was desperate, nothing, not men, not vehicles, not even other animals, could stand in its way. And the poachers knew it. They had begun setting traps near the last remaining water sources, betting on dehydration to weaken their prey. Carcasses of fallen zebras and antelopes were found near poison-watering holes, their deaths slow and agonizing. Daniel and his team worked tirelessly to track the culprits, but the land was vast, and the criminals were ghosts in the wilderness. The tension in the park was palpable. Something was coming. The radio crackled to life just as Daniel finished refueling his patrol vehicle. Joseph's voice came through, tight with urgency. "We've got trouble. A group of National Geographic photographers is stuck near the northern ravine. A herd of elephants is moving fast in their direction." Daniel swore under his breath. Tourists. They always thought they understood the land, thought they could predict its dangers. But nature was chaos. It was not meant to be tamed. He didn't waste time. Throwing the vehicle into gear, he sped toward the northern plains, dust swirling behind him. As he crested the hill, his stomach twisted. The scene was worse than he had imagined. The photographer's vehicle was tilted at a dangerous angle, one of its tires lodged in a deep rut of soft riverbed soil. They were frantically trying to free it, but it was no use. And just beyond them, a thundering cloud of dust signaled the approach of the herd. Daniel gritted his teeth. If he didn't act now, the photographers wouldn't stand a chance. He accelerated, cutting across the grassland, hoping to intercept the stampede before it was too late. But as he neared, the ground beneath him betrayed him. The riverbed, still damp from the last rainfall weeks ago, gave way. His tires sank. The engine whined as he tried to reverse, but it was useless. He was stuck. And the elephants were coming. The herd was led by a matriarch, a massive, battle-scarred giant, her tusks curved like ancient relics. She was panicked, her ears flaring as she trumpeted her distress. She had lost control of her herd. The younger bulls, agitated and desperate, fed off her fear, their enormous bodies moving in a deadly wave of raw power. And Daniel was directly in their path. His pulse thundered in his ears. He reached for his rifle, not to shoot, but to fire a warning round, to make enough noise to divert their course. But as his fingers wrapped around the weapon, he knew it was too late. The matriarch had locked onto him. Her dark eyes burned with the primal rage of a mother protecting her own. And then, she charged. A roar. It was not the trumpet of an elephant, nor the panicked cries of the photographers. It was something deeper, something that shook the very bones of the land. From the tall grass, a golden shadow leapt into the open. Bantu. The lion's mane rippled as he landed between Daniel's vehicle and the charging elephant, his body coiled with unshaken defiance. His roar tore through the air again, echoing across the plains. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The matriarch hesitated. Her massive foot stomped the ground, her head swinging toward this unexpected challenger. Bantu did not back down. He did not flee. Despite being dwarfed by the elephant's immense form, he stood his ground, his muscles taut, his teeth bared in a silent promise of battle. Daniel could hardly breathe. He had seen lions fight before. He had seen them take down buffalo, challenge hyenas, even stand against humans when cornered. But this was something different. Bantu was not hunting. He was protecting. The matriarch let out another blast of air through her trunk, shifting her weight. The younger elephants in the herd grew restless, their movements uncertain. Then, in an act that defied every instinct, she turned. With a final, frustrated trumpet, she wheeled around, leading her herd away from the danger. The earth trembled as they retreated, their massive forms disappearing into the shimmering heat of the distance. Daniel let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Bantu remained still for a moment, his flanks heaving with exertion. His golden fur was dusted with dirt, his eyes sharp with an intensity Daniel had never seen before. And then, just as silently as he had arrived, the lion turned and limped back into the grassland, vanishing like a phantom into the wind. Daniel sat frozen in his vehicle, his hands still gripping the wheel. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Lions did not behave like that. Instinct should have told Bantu to flee, to stay out of the path of such an enormous threat. But he hadn't. He had placed himself between Daniel and certain death. It wasn't chance. It wasn't a coincidence. It was loyalty. For the first time in his life, Daniel realized that some bonds were beyond explanation. Beyond logic, beyond the boundaries of species. Bantu wasn't just a wild animal. He was a guardian. And Daniel was now certain of one thing. Whatever had been forged between them the day he freed Bantu, it was far from over. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sun-baked grass as Daniel and Joseph set out toward the northern plains. Reports had come in about a group of poachers moving through the area, dangerous men, armed and desperate. The rangers had been chasing ghosts for weeks, tracking the remnants of their operations but never catching them in the act. This time, however, they had a lead. Joseph adjusted his rifle as they weaved through the tall acacia trees, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape. "You feel it?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded. He had learned long ago to trust the subtle shift in the Serengeti's rhythm. The usual sounds of the wild, the rustling of birds, the distant grunts of hippos, had faded. The land was too quiet. Then came the gunfire. It exploded around them, the sharp crack of rifles cutting through the stillness. Joseph grunted and staggered back, his hand clutching his shoulder. "Down!" Daniel shouted, shoving him behind a fallen tree just as another round whistled past his head. He pressed against the rough bark, heart hammering, sweat trickling down his temple. It was a trap. Joseph winced, gripping his wound. "It's bad," he muttered through clenched teeth. Daniel checked his magazine. Half empty. They were outnumbered, pinned down, and the poachers weren't letting up. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing. They had to hold on, just long enough for backup to arrive. Then, just when hope began to slip away, the ground trembled. A roar split the night, deep and primal, rattling through Daniel's chest like rolling thunder. It was not the sound of an animal warning an intruder. It was the sound of war. From the darkness, a golden blur erupted. Bantu. The lion moved like a shadow set ablaze, his powerful body covering the distance in mere seconds. The poachers barely had time to react before Bantu was among them. One man screamed as the lion slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The others turned their rifles toward the sudden threat, but panic had set in. Shots rang out in confusion, some wild, some hitting nothing but the air. Daniel took the opening. He swung his rifle up and fired, striking one of the poachers in the leg. Joseph, despite his wound, managed to raise his pistol and return fire. The ambush crumbled. The remaining poachers fled, their courage breaking beneath the weight of fear. But not before one of them, one desperate enough to defy instinct, turned and fired a single shot toward the lion. Bantu jerked back. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched the bullet hit. The lion staggered, his body momentarily unsteady. But he did not fall. Instead, Bantu planted himself between Daniel, Joseph, and the retreating figures. Blood darkened his golden fur, but he did not waver. He stood as he always had, watching over them. The battle was over. The reinforcements arrived minutes later, rounding up the remaining poachers. But Daniel barely registered the arrests, barely heard the orders shouted through the radio. His focus was only on Bantu. The lion's breathing was shallow, his sides heaving as he lay in the tall grass. The bullet wound near his ribs bled sluggishly, and his powerful limbs trembled with exhaustion. Daniel knelt beside him, his hands shaking as he reached out. He had treated countless wounds before, but never like this. Never this helplessly. "You didn't owe me anything," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Bantu blinked slowly. Daniel had always wondered if the lion truly understood him, if the connection between them was something real or simply his own wishful thinking. But in that moment, there was no doubt. Bantu's amber eyes met his, and within them, Daniel saw something deep, something ancient. A silent acknowledgement. A farewell. Then, with a final, slow breath, Bantu closed his eyes. And he was gone. The poachers were brought to justice, but Daniel felt no triumph. Only loss. The news of Bantu's final stand spread throughout the rangers, the park, and beyond. Some dismissed it as a coincidence, as an animal acting on instinct. But those who had witnessed it, who had heard the lion's roar in the night, who had seen him take his place between man and danger, they knew better. In the hospital, as Joseph recovered from his wounds, he looked at Daniel with a knowing expression. "That lion gave you something more than protection," he murmured. "He gave you proof that the wild has a soul." Daniel said nothing. But when he returned to the plains, when he looked across the golden horizon and felt the absence of something that had once been there, he understood. Some debts could never be repaid. Some bonds were beyond explanation. And some guardians, no matter how wild, never truly leave. The years passed, but the memory never faded. Daniel Whitaker remained a ranger, patrolling the vast, untamed beauty of the Serengeti. His hands had grown rougher, his hair streaked with gray, but his heart still belonged to the land. He had seen generations of animals rise and fall, watched the great migrations carve their eternal path across the plains, and fought tirelessly against the relentless greed of poachers. But he was no longer the same man who had once walked these lands. There was something different in the way he carried himself, in the quiet reverence with which he moved through the wilderness. He had always respected the animals, but now, he understood them in a way few ever could. And the legend of the lion who had repaid a debt with his life, of Bantu, only grew. Among the rangers, his story became something sacred. Around campfires and under the endless African sky, they spoke in hushed voices of the lion guardian, the beast who had walked with a man, who had fought not for survival, but for loyalty. Even the local Maasai people, who had long held lions in both fear and awe, whispered of Bantu as something more than an animal. A spirit, they said. A protector. A presence that had once roamed the Serengeti and might yet still remain. Daniel never argued. He never corrected them. Because deep down, he hoped they were right. One evening, as the sun dipped low, setting the horizon ablaze with fire and gold, Daniel climbed a familiar hill, the one where he had last seen Bantu before the battle that had taken him. The years had not changed this place. The grass still swayed in waves beneath the warm breath of the wind. The land still stretched vast and untamed, a world untouched by time. Daniel stood in silence, his rifle slung over his back, his boots planted firmly in the earth. And then, for just a moment, he saw it. A silhouette against the setting sun. A great lion standing atop the distant ridge, mane rippling in the evening wind. His heart caught in his throat. He blinked, stepping forward, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the twilight, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. Daniel exhaled, a slow, knowing smile touching his lips. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light. Perhaps it had been nothing at all. Or perhaps, just for a fleeting second, Bantu had returned, to watch over him one last time. Some debts can never be repaid. Some bonds exist beyond the understanding of men. And true loyalty, whether born of man or beast, knows no boundaries at all.